you've probably heard of this program before, but I want to give a little bit of an overview about it. So the Launched Legumes is a program that was launched just a little bit over a year ago. And what it did is it allocated $900,000 in the state of Minnesota to convert your typical traditional turf grass lawns to some pollinator-friendly form of planting. And the state entity that manages those funds is Bowser, or the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. So today, if myself or Angie talks about Bowser, we're not talking about any Nintendo characters. We're talking about the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. Where Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms come in is we're helping Bowser coordinate the technical assistance. So individuals that receive one of those Launched Legumes grant, individuals that want to know how to install plantings for pollinators, and education, so just like the workshop today. Individuals from Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms help out with those portions of the grant allocation of the $900,000 allocated to that fund through that funding.
And Washington Conservation District is a local unit of government that has served Washington County since 1942. We've actually been around more than 75 years. The district was created in the wake of the Dust Bowl as a way to work with farmers on erosion control, protecting soil health, and making sure that we wouldn't have any environmental disasters like that happen again. One of the things that people most like about our organization is that we provide free site visits to landowners across the county, so that whether you live in an apartment, you have a large farm, you have a a suburban house, we have staff who are specialized in working with that kind of property that can come and talk to you about projects, everything on the scale from a small native garden to doing a really large buffer planting along a stream or a lake. We also work hand in hand with the local watershed districts. Today's presentation is co-sponsored with the Valley Branch Watershed District, but we work with the county, we work with the cities, and so we're very in tune with what grants are available. We can help people to apply for watershed district cost share grants, but also if you're working on a larger project, we usually know when there's grant funds available for things like that. And most people, if you are familiar with our organization, know that we host a lot of educational workshops throughout the year. This year they've been primarily webinars. But we do also have volunteer events, and in normal years, we have some, fun, family-friendly community events as well.
So we're going to start off today with a little bit of an introduction to the Launched Legumes program, go over the basic goals and some resources that are available to everyone, whether you receive a grant or you just want to go ahead and get some pollinator habitat established on your own landscape. So the Launched Legumes program has three basic goals, the first of which is to protect pollinators with a focus on the federally endangered state bee, the rusty patch bumblebee. So Senshu, I saw you throw in the chat that you are looking to help out this bumblebee, so hopefully we can provide you with the tools to do so here. And how they want to go about protecting this bee is by assisting landowners across the entire state of Minnesota in establishing high-quality pollinator habitat. But in talking to residents, it's not really the establishing the habitat part that people are concerned with or maybe have the most difficulty with, but what many residents indicated as one of the biggest obstacles they face was actually maintaining these plantings. So one of the core tenets of this program is making sure that residents also have the tools and knowledge needed to maintain and ensure the long-term success of these projects. When we think about what a successful project looks like through Launched Legumes, it's not a planting that exists 1 or 2 or 5 years. We want these plantings to exist for decades. So hopefully we give you the tools to create a prairie in your landscape that lasts for many, many decades into the future. So you probably heard me say that we have a new state bee, and the fact of the matter here is that even as much as I love bees, you generally don't get a state bee unless there's something really critical happening. And unfortunately, that is the case with the rusty patch bumblebee. So the rusty patch bumblebee is a bee that was once ubiquitous throughout much of the United States. It was common in the north central United States, much of the Midwest, the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and even some parts of southeastern Minnesota. And since we want all of you to be stewards of rusty patch bumblebee conservation, I want to discuss a little bit of its history, where it is now, and go over kind of the basic biology and ecology of this bee species. So I mentioned that it was once common throughout the United States, but in the past 20 years or so, we've seen declines in the population of this bee species by nearly 90%. 87% is the number you'll find through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And even further than that, the range constrictions is what's possibly even more concerning. So if we think about where the rusty patch bumblebee existed historically versus where it is now, it's only present in less than 1% of its historic habitat. What's lucky for us as Minnesotans is the state of Minnesota is currently one of the strongholds for this bee species. So this means that when we put native plantings, especially native pollinator-friendly plantings into the ground, we have the opportunity to conserve an endangered species. So I want to go over a little bit about what the rusty patch bumblebee needs to survive. So first, the rusty patch bumblebee, like many other bumblebee species, is a ground nesting bee. That being said, when it comes to where it'll nest in the ground, the rusty patch bumblebee really is a bit of a generalist. Anything from an abandoned rodent's nest to a patch of your yard that's only sparsely covered with turf grass, any sort of bare soil will be perfectly suitable habitat for the rusty patch bumblebee. Something that Angie and I will really harp in on today is the idea of native blooming flowers throughout the growing season, or what we'll call staggered bloom times. Some bee species are active early in the season, some bee species are active late in the season. The rusty patch bumblebee will be active as soon as April and as deep as into October. So the rusty patch bumblebee is going to need resources. It's going to need forage, nectar, and pollen throughout all of those months. So we want to make sure that your gardens have something blooming all throughout the growing season. And not only is this good for the rusty patch bumblebee and all of its friends, but this will give you something visually stimulating throughout the entirety of the bloom season. So pretty colors year round, or at least throughout the growing season. And so in talking to residents, one of the other things that we've learned is that it can kind of be difficult to convince a resident that the habitat they're establishing on their residential property alone can actually make a difference towards conserving an endangered species. What we want you to think of is your pollinator patch that you're going to establish, it's not acting on its own. It's part of a connected, high-quality pollinator corridor. So what I like to use to kind of drive this point in is we're all working together to create this pollinator highway. And I want you to think of your planting as one pit stop along that pollinator highway, where these bees can stop, grab their nectar, grab their pollen, and continue their journey to whatever their final destination is. In addition to establishing habitat and thinking about nesting needs, we also want to think about protection from insecticides. One insecticide that you may have heard of is neonicotinoids. That stands for new nicotines. This particular type of chemical is extremely harmful to pollinators. So whenever you're going out and buying plants, we want you to try and make sure that first they're not applied with, no chemicals are applied to these plantings, but especially those neonicotinoid chemicals. And to kind of broaden the scope a little bit when talking about chemicals, whether it's preparing for the installation of a new planting, so site preparation, or maintaining an already installed planting, we want you to think of chemicals as an absolute last resort rather than kind of a catch-all solution to all of your issues. So we definitely encourage you to use integrated pest management and think about all of the options that can be taken before applying a chemical when you're going to install a new planting or when you're going to maintain a pre-existing planting. So a little bit more about lawns to legumes. When we think about where we're going to allocate funding, we try to do that based on two things. Access to high quality habitat. So if we want this habitat to be connected, putting in new plantings where there's already some plantings nearby will have an increased effect. And we also did this based on historic records of the rusty patch bumblebee. So there's 3 different priority zones for the individual support that Lawns to Legumes is providing. And I'll go over those 3 different zones. So that dark green color on the map, that represents your first tier priority zone. This means 2 different things. 1, there's already nearby high quality pollinator friendly plantings. And 2, we've seen rusty patch bumblebee records, so sightings of the rusty patch bumblebee within the past 10 years. The next priority zone would be that kind of lime green color. And here, one of 2 things are true. Either we have seen the rusty patch bumblebee within the past 20 years, or there's already access to high quality forage. This means that there is records that the rusty patch bumblebee can survive here. We just have to work on bringing it back. Or if there's already high quality pollinator habitat here, that means if the rusty patch bumblebee were to spread here, there's evidence to suggest that it would do well and the populations would be able to expand. But even if you're in that kind of pale yellow part of Minnesota, where there haven't been historic rusty patch bumblebee sightings and there maybe isn't the best access to pollinator forage, you can still absolutely receive a grant it's a slightly lower chance of receiving a grant, but we wanted to make sure that funding went to all parts of Minnesota. What we're hoping here is that even though we haven't seen the rusty patch bumblebee yet, and there's not great access to forage yet, if we get enough plantings in the ground, maybe the rusty patch bumblebee will come, and if it shows up, it'll have plenty of access to food if we get those new plantings in the ground. So individual support, every resident in the state of Minnesota was eligible to apply for a grant that's worth up to $350, but it's not just putting money in your pockets that we think is powerful in terms of individual support. We're trying to provide workshops just like the one that Angie and Lauren and I are leading today. And we're also trying to provide lots of online resources such that if you receive a grant or if you want to do a DIY project, there's all the information you need to create a successful planting. And that's really where the Lawns to Legumes Planting for Pollinators guide comes in. It gives a very thorough overview of all the different planting types that Angie and I are going to discuss today. It provides you with planting templates, just like this one, where in talking to residents, some individuals are just absolutely overwhelmed by the sheer number of native plants to choose from. There are thousands of plants out there. It's hard to know when each of them bloom, how far they all spread, which plants work well together. And these little planting templates do all that busy work for you. Something that's really nice that these plantings do is, let's say for one reason or another, you're not a huge fan of pussy toes, there are replacement plants that you can choose. So if you want to boot out one of the plantings included in this planting template in favor of a plant that maybe has a different color or a different floral shape, you can make substitutions very easily. One of the most common questions we get is simply, what is a legume and why is this program called Lawns to Legumes? So firstly, legumes are more than just peas. There are lots of really great native and non-native pollinator-friendly plants included in the legume group. Some examples of that are purple prairie clover, one of my absolute favorite plants to include for pollinators, milk vetch and lead plant, and even the non-native Dutch white clover, which is a really fantastic resource to include in a bee lawn. So my master's work was focused all on bee lawns with a heavy focus on Dutch white clover. I've seen well over 50 bee species foraging on Dutch white clover alone, the vast majority of which were native bee species. So that flower can really do a lot of work in terms of conserving our pollinators. But the fact of the matter is, we want you to consider any and all native pollinator-friendly species. Why we call this program Lawns to Legumes is politicians apparently really like alliteration, and Lawns to Legumes was a little bit easier off the tongue than Lawns to pollinator-friendly native plants, but also Dutch white clover, because even though it's not native, it works so well in bee lawns and it can serve so many bees. Lawns to Legumes just a little bit more concise there. But all of your favorite native flowers that bees love and that they've co-evolved with, like wild bergamot, like columbine, like blazing star, which is also fantastic for monarchs. I can't tell you how many monarchs I've seen on blazing star. Those are all welcome in your Lawns to Legumes plantings and any plantings you do with the Washington Conservation District. So at this point, I think we'll stop and let residents throw in some questions that they might have for Angie and I, or really Angie, Lauren, and I.
Yeah, and you can, oh, looks like we've got a question in the chat. As a Ramsey County Master Gardener, I get a lot of questions and concerns about plants that attract pollinators. What are the stats on how many bees sting and how to overcome the stigma of bees, especially for families with young kids who use the lawn a lot?
That is a fantastic question. So by species, almost all bees sting. If we go within a species, something that not many people realize is it's actually only the female bees that sting. The stinger is actually a modification to the egg-laying part of a bee. So it's really only those female bees that sting. But I can tell you that I have spent God knows how many days walking through pollinator habitat. I know for my master's work, I spent somewhere close to like the equivalent of like 11 days walking through pollinator habitat. And I was only stung twice. Once was because a bumblebee got caught in my shoe, so I don't blame her for that. And one time a honeybee just got upset and stung me. What I tend to recommend for individuals that use their lawn area a lot is two things. One, it's really helpful if you isolate different portions of your lawn area of the yard that you manage for different purposes. So if you want to have areas of your yard that are dedicated to recreation, just try and have some nice edging or barriers between where the pollinators forage, between your garden, and where the kids play for recreation. The bees, for the most part, and the pollinators in general, they want to stay by the flowers. The last thing they want to do is get caught up in what it is that you're doing. Bees are very simple. Pollinators are very simple. They like to eat. They like to sleep. And that's about it. We'll talk even a little bit more about that in just a few slides. What I would recommend if there's, if you want to do a flowering lawn, if you do want to have a little bit of an intermix between recreation and pollinator habitat, is definitely make sure you're wearing closed-toed shoes. The vast majority of bee stings that I've heard about happen when an individual accidentally steps on an area where a pollinator was foraging. The bee gets caught under the foot, gets scared, and stings you. So closed-toed shoes and trying your best to isolate where you play and where you have recreation would be my recommendations.
Okay, any other questions?
Looks like someone
Right.
just...
Yep, it was just a thanks.
Oh, okay, great.
All right, so...
Yeah, oh, sorry. Let me just get back to that slide real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, so when we think about why pollinators need our help so much, the main thing that I think our research is leading us to believe is the cause of these population declines is the loss of habitat for pollinators. Particularly in Minnesota, I'm talking about the loss of prairie habitat. So if we look together at the map on our right, what we're looking at is prairie coverage throughout the Minnesota, both historic and current. Where the yellow areas represent our historic prairie coverage, where you could see Minnesota was covered, especially in the southern and western parts of our state, really thoroughly covered in prairie habitat. And that shows prairie coverage up to the year 1900. But what the red shows is our current prairie coverage. And what we have is less than 2% of the historic prairie coverage that we had through the year 1900. And kind of unfortunate, a little bit of a doom and gloom stat that I like to share about this map is the red pixels you see on it are actually an exaggeration of the prairie coverage in Minnesota. Some of those pixels had to be artificially enlarged. That way they could just be perceived by the human eye. So what you're seeing on that map is actually an exaggeration of the current prairie coverage here in Minnesota. And when we think of the reasons why pollinators are losing this prairie habitat, it's largely due to human intervention, human land development. And this isn't something that's restricted to rural areas with farmland or suburban areas with housing units and streets and parks, everything that's associated with suburban complexes, and urbanization, where you see parking lots, residential buildings, commercial buildings. It's really anywhere where humans are interacting with the landscape. So rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas, they're all examples of ways that humans have turned natural landscapes into a landscape that meets our needs. So what we're largely trying to convince or push residents to do is that in these areas of the landscape that you manage, whether it's your lawn, whether it's a garden, whether it's a shared area in your community where you're able to, have a say in what gets planted, we just want you to bring a little bit of that prairie back into your landscape. Bring in some flowers that the pollinators know and love, and they'll show you that love right back by foraging on those plants. We often like to use the metro area as an example of just how much our communities have changed, where here when we look at the metro area of Minnesota, the areas in purple show the remaining native plant communities. All of that clear area that's not filled in, that is an area without native plants, mostly characterized by impervious surfaces or non-green parts of the landscape. So we want to bring back more of that purple, and we think we can do that by getting these plants into your yard, into your landscape.
So our office works a lot on water quality issues, and we have staff who monitor about 80 lakes and 44 streams across Washington County. And they're looking at a variety of water quality concerns. We're talking about native plants today in terms of how they benefit pollinators specifically, but native plants have this whole range of benefits as well. And in terms of helping to protect clean water, protect our lakes and our streams and our drinking water, some of the other things that you can think about, one is reducing pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. It's a big risk to the insects, to the pollinator species, but some of these can also infiltrate down into the ground and make their way into the groundwater resources. Pollutants from impervious areas. This is a photo of some salt over applied in a commercial area. This impacts aquatic insects, and a lot of insects that are terrestrial insects will actually lay their eggs in the water. So this can affect a lot of the terrestrial insects as well as the fish that are eating these. In our developed communities, stormwater pollution is the #1 source of water pollution. And we've created a system over time to help protect our homes from flooding. If you live in a developed neighborhood, you probably have a storm drain in front of your house. You've seen when it rains how the water will go down the street and it goes into these storm drains. The problem is that it picks up all sorts of stuff along the way. So it's picking up dirt, any oil that's dripped onto the ground, the grass, clippings, the leaves, dog poop if people aren't picking up their dog poop, the salt, all of this gunk. And it ends up in our lakes and usually untreated. And newer communities, it's sometimes going through a stormwater pond and getting treated along the way. But in a lot of the older places, it's just going straight into the water untreated, and it contributes to algae blooms and other water quality problems. We've also seen over the past 10 years that precipitation is going up across Minnesota, in our part of Minnesota especially. And so we're getting a lot more rain and a lot larger rain events during the year, and that is causing flooding problems. We've been hearing about that all last year and all this year in Washington County, people with concerns of flooding and high water. And people are often asking us, what can I do as an individual? These are big problems, changing weather and climate change is a big problem. Stormwater pollution is a big problem. But about 78% of the land is privately owned and managed. So private landowners, anybody who owns a house, who owns a farm, who owns property, play a really big role in rebuilding the network of habitat and helping to restore our water. Let's see. I think I'm turning things over to you again, James, to talk specifically about pollinators.
Yeah. And just quickly to just slightly build on what Angie said, when I think about how water moves through a property whenever I'm working with a resident during a site assessment, I love to encourage them to think critically about how water moves through their property and use that as an advantage to think about where they want to put habitat. So if you can both install pollinator habitat and capture stormwater runoff, then you're talking about, multiple benefits to a property. So just some food for thought there. So now a little bit on pollinator needs. So pollinators definitely need protection from pesticides in order to survive. We're going to do our best to remember that chemicals are an absolute last resort when we're maintaining and installing a landscape. And when we're sourcing our plants, we're going to do our best to make sure that we purchase flowers that haven't been treated with insecticides, especially those neonicotinoids. Pollinators need access to clean water. So actually the majority of the water that they'll get is from nectar, but on a hot day like we've been having these past 2 days, it's absolutely not uncommon to see pollinators hanging out at standing bodies of water, drinking what they can. So we want to make sure that that water is clean and uncontaminated. Pollinators need flower resources through the growing season. So remember the rusty patch bumblebee and, excuse me, I think I have to sneeze. Never mind. So yeah, they need flower resources through the growing season. So you'll hear Angie and I say the phrase staggered bloom times, hopefully close to 1,000 times today. And even if we do hit that 1,000 number, that still probably wasn't enough. So remember that the rusty patch bumblebee is active from April through October, and there are all sorts of different species of bees, all with different activity times. There are early season bees like osmia. I'll show you a picture of an osmia bee in just a few slides. There's mid-season bees like lots of bees from the genus Lacioglossum, and there's late season bees, like bees from the genus Ogochlorella. I'll show you one of those later as well. So remember, different flowers with different bloom times for different bee species, and even some bee species that are active throughout the entirety of the growing season. Pollinator needs also need nesting sites, and we'll talk about establishing plantings and using mulch to establish plantings. Don't think that by mulching an area, you're covering up their nesting sites. You can have parts within your yard that are for foraging and parts of your yard that are nesting sites. But remember, bees have normally around a 2-kilometer foraging range, so it of course varies by the size of the bee. But as long as there's somewhere for bees to nest nearby your garden, you're not going to be disturbing their nesting behavior. But what we're really going to focus on for this part of the presentation is this idea of creating a network of habitat and protected refuge areas. And do remember that we're talking about more than just bumblebees and more than just honeybees. It tends to be the honeybees and the bumblebees that kind of get the majority of the press coverage and the kind of media coverage. Even though the rusty patch bumblebee is the first bee species to be listed as endangered in the continental United States, I can guarantee you that there are plenty of other bees that need our help right here in Minnesota. In the state of Minnesota, we've got well over 400 bees, probably pushing around 450 bees. In the United States, there's over 4,000 bee species, and worldwide, there's right around 20,000 bee species. Bumblebees and honeybees account for about 1.5% to 2% of those bee species. The other 98.5% are something else. It can be other bees from the family Apidae. There's ground nesting bees, there's stem nesting bees, all different sorts of bees, and they all need our help. So hopefully when we're establishing this pollinator habitat, we're not only saving the rusty patch bumblebee who needs our help, we're not only saving bumblebees and honeybees that receive the majority of the media coverage, we're receiving all of the bees in between as well. We're helping, rather, all of the bees in between as well. And pollinators even goes beyond just bees. So butterflies also get a lot of attention. Butterflies and bees tend to be the most efficient pollinators thanks to that body hair. So I'll show you an image later, or rather a video later, of a bumblebee actually grooming pollen on their body hairs. And those hairs, they just hold that pollen really nicely. But there are other taxonomic groups that do conduct pollination. Hummingbirds visit flowers and move pollen, beetles, other lepidopterans, other moths and skippers. There's all sorts of different pollinators. Even bats and lizards can pollinate. In many desert landscapes, bats are some of the most important pollinators, and in many island landscapes, lizards can be some of the most important pollinators. So just remember that pollinators come in all shapes and sizes, and when you plant flowers, you're helping so many different types of creatures, especially our invertebrates, and everything that feeds on them and everything up and down the food chain that's reliant on those species. We receive lots of questions about these artificial hive boxes, and they're kind of a mixed bag, but I do want to cover them just briefly. So every bee has two basic needs, food and shelter, and food is what we'll really be focusing in today, because that is the most easy basic solution that we can provide you with. Simply plant flowers, and we'll give you lots of research today on how to do that. But what these flowers do is they provide nectar, which is the main source of sugar for a pollinator, and they provide pollen as well, which is their protein source. We're going to say that we're going to talk a lot about using a wide diversity of species. So remember, diverse plantings conserve diverse bee populations, and we're going to talk a lot about having staggered bloom times. So we want diversity both in the flowers that we're using and when they're active, when those flowers are active. What we don't talk about quite as much is what you can do to provide shelter for bees. So of course, keeping a little bit of your soil exposed is good for ground nesting bees. Having areas in your community where bees can access the ground is also going to provide nesting habitat. But these artificial hive boxes are becoming more and more popular. So what they are is it's a kind of a collection of stems, and you'll notice that the stems have different diameters. Wider diameters for larger bee species and more narrow diameters for smaller bee species. And what's super important about these artificial stems is that you must keep them clean. If you don't keep those artificial stems clean, you're creating a potentially inhabitable form of habitat for these bees. So a form of habitat where they're not going to survive and thrive and be successful. Something else to take note of is that even if your intention is to have bees in there, it's very likely that you'll have some wasps as well, so just don't be alarmed when you see wasps in those artificial stems. As for the breakdown as to where bees nest, it's estimated that right around 60% of bees are ground nesting bees, around 30% of bees are cavity nesters, and a small portion are parasitic bees. So they actually lay their eggs on other species, whether it be a fly, whether it be even another bee species. So some parasites, but mostly ground and stem nesting bees. A little bit about the stem nesting life cycle and plants that you can use for them. So some common stem nesting bees include carpenter bees, mason bees, resin bees, and small carpenter bees. So when most of you think of carpenter bees, you might be thinking of those very large bumblebee-like bees, but there's actually all sorts of different carpenter bees. One that's pretty common here is Xylocopa, which has this kind of like navy blue iridescent color to it. And that's actually a stem nesting carpenter bee. And how these stems work is the bees will lay their egg, and they'll also put in a provision of some food. And they'll kind of layer the stem like that. So it'll go egg, food, and some building materials mixed in there just to kind of add structure to the nest. So what we recommend you do is try to think critically about what different plants are used by stem nesting bees, and leave some cuttings in your landscape if you want to try and provide habitat for those bee species. Here's some examples of different pollinator-friendly plants that also provide nesting habitat with their hollow and pithy stems. A lot of this information comes from the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. They have a stem nesting bee specialist there. Her name is Colleen Stadisher, who does all sorts of who does all sorts of research on what plants these bees are using and when they tend to emerge from those nests. So plant species like Joe Pyeweed, elderberry, Indian grass, aromatic aster, any sort of plant with a pithy and kind of hollowed out stem will serve as really good nesting habitat for those stem nesting bee species. And finally, onto building those pollinator corridors, or that network of habitat. So we often like to use this string of images. This string of images shows Minneapolis to show just how powerful pollinator patches can be. So we'll start with that image furthest to your left, where we're showing just the existing known high quality habitat in Minneapolis. You'll notice a lot of that dark green color is by different bodies of water, whether it be the Mississippi River, whether it be the lakes in southwest Minneapolis. You'll see different scatterings of that dark green that shows high quality habitat. What we've done in the image in the middle is we've added a 200-meter buffer around those habitats that represents the distance that small pollinators can fly. And I know what you're all thinking, but James, the rusty patch bumblebee is obviously a medium to large size pollinator and can travel way further than that. We just like to be safe and use a conservative measure, because the worst thing that happens is we end up adding more pollinator habitat than what is actually needed. And believe me, the pollinators are not going to complain about having too much food. So what you can see in that middle image is even when we include that 200-meter buffer, there are still some parts of Minneapolis where the pollinators can't travel freely. If you're in South Minneapolis and you want to travel north to the river or through North Minneapolis, there's a lot of white area, a lot of impervious surface that you have to travel through to get to your next meal. Our ultimate goal is to have this entire map covered in green. And that's where you can start to see the power of individual plantings when you look at the map on your right. So all we've done here in this map on your right is we've added just the rain gardens that have been installed through the work of Metro Blooms. Keep in mind that that is a very small fraction of all of the native plantings that exist in Minneapolis from the work that residents have done. But we already see is a much greater degree of connectedness. Much of South Minneapolis is connected to the western and eastern parts of Minneapolis. There's way more plantings throughout North Minneapolis. And we just see a much greater degree of connectedness. And we want to take this example, this little microcosm, and apply it to the entire state of Minnesota, where if we can add in more individual plantings, we can create a corridor throughout the state where bees and all other pollinators can travel freely and easily throughout their state with constant access to forage. In addition, we always like to be thinking about kind of the stacked benefits of pollinator plantings and native plants, where of course they're providing forage for our bees, they provide that nectar, they provide that pollen, but there's so many other benefits that happen as well. So Angie already talked about just how important it is to think about how water moves through your landscape and the different kind of issues that are imposed by water and the gunk that it carries. But trees and shrubs can also provide shade to a house, reducing your energy costs, and they capture carbon. The plants that you establish, they have these really deep, complex root systems that sequester carbon, they re-engineer the soil. And when they do that, when they re-engineer that soil, it builds healthy soils that helps plants establish. It's a really good habitat for fungi and bacteria. So try and think about all of the different benefits that establishing native plants can have on your landscape, even beyond protecting pollinators.
Okay, I'm going to take over from here. Thank you so much, James. That was really interesting to hear about the different kinds of bees and their nesting behaviors. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that Washington Conservation District offers free site visits for any county residents. If you are someone who lives in a different county, very often your Soil and Water Conservation District will also offer a site visit like this. But what you can expect, a lot of people want to know, what happens during the site visit, and somebody will help you kind of look at your yard and analyze where the water is flowing, when it's coming off of your roof, when it's coming off of the driveway, where is it sunny, where is it shady, and then find opportunities for enhancing the habitat, maybe putting in a native garden, maybe putting in a rain garden. This is something that you can do on your own as well. And when we do this with people in workshops, you take a piece of one of those kind of semi-transparent tracing papers and you can put it over an aerial image of your property. And that's a nice way to be able to try out different options that you can, color in. Well, what would it look like if I have a garden here? Or what would it look like if I put something here? Kind of the first step is to figure out where do you want to be able to recreate, use your lawn, like James was talking about earlier. And maybe where are areas that you don't ever go there except for when you're mowing. That might be the place that you want to put a native garden, someplace that's kind of inconvenient and not being used. So we've already talked a lot about why native plants for their habitat benefits. Have some lovely photos here of different, both the birds, the bees, the butterflies that will use the native plants. They also have really important benefits for water quality. We always use this image, and it shows the roots of native prairie plants compared with turf grass. And if you are, digging down and looking at the turf grass, it's got roots that are maybe like 2 inches deep. They're really not very deep at all. If you let your turf grass go a little bit taller, 3 or 4 inches, the roots will be a little bit deeper and your grass will be more resilient to drought, but they're never going to go deeper than that. You compare that with some of these native flowers, some of the native grasses, and their roots might be going down 8, 10, even 12 feet deep. They're really extensive root systems, and it's not just one root, it's a whole network of roots. So these roots are very good at stabilizing the soil along shorelines and stream banks on steep hillsides. They do a very good job of breaking up compacted soil over time. And about 1/3 of the roots will actually slough off during the year. So this kind of creates little, almost like straw holes into the soil where the water can infiltrate. It helps to improve infiltration. So they're both good for too much water and not enough water. You won't usually ever need to water them. So they're very good for drought conditions, but on the flip side, when there's a lot of water, they're good at getting it into the ground, having more of it soak in instead of running off the way it might if you just have a turf lawn. So I'm going to talk about 4 main kinds of projects that are promoted through the Lawns to Legumes program. And I'll turn it over to James when we get to the pollinator lawns. But the first one that people are most often interested in when they're talking to us is doing just a native garden. Sometimes you might hear it called like a butterfly garden, a pollinator garden. And these are just like a regular garden that you have on in your yard, except that it features the native plants that have the really good pollinator nectar sources in them. So it can be something as small as 10 by 10. It can be a much larger area if you need it to be, but there's room in almost every yard to have a native plant garden. Some of these can even be grown in containers. So if you're somebody who lives in a condominium or an apartment and you've got a balcony, you could try to grow some of these plants in a container as well, just to be able to have a little bit of color and a little bit of pollinator nectar source there. The installation, the big challenge is going to be if you already have existing turf that you need to get rid of. There's a couple of different options. One is to just literally manually dig it out if it's a small enough area. I have used a sod cutter before to do a larger area. Putting down sheet mulch, covering it up so that it is solarized. There's a lot of different ways that you can kill off the existing grass that's there without having to use a lot of chemicals. But the fun part comes after that when you get to begin choosing the flowers that you want to put in there. We tell people there's a lot of resistance in some communities to native gardens because there's a perception that they're really wild and woolly. And so there's some of these cues to care that you can include that will help to make it really obvious that your native garden is indeed a garden and not just an area where you stopped mowing the lawn. And edges are probably the most important thing. Putting in something like a brick edge, a really obvious cut edge along the lawn, having some rock, having some hardscaping, something that makes it look very intentional. It kind of creates a frame, like a picture frame that you would have a piece of art in. That always makes the art look better if it's got a picture frame than if it's just kind of got messy edges. So one of the kinds of gardens that you are most likely to be able to get watershed district cost share funding for is a rain garden. And really what you're doing is taking a native garden and you're just digging it out ever so slightly and putting it in a place where the water is running off of a roof or running off of a driveway. So the rain garden can capture that water and give it time to either soak into the ground or be absorbed by the plants or evaporate. And we have installed something in the neighborhood of 1,500 rain gardens across Washington County in partnership with landowners. So the rain gardens are really, really common. You will see them sometimes along the edges of a road where they're a little bit deeper and there's actually a curb cut to be able to catch water coming off of the road. But you can put them at the bottom of a downspout as well. We've got a little installation video here to show you. So I'll just click on this and James can pop in maybe if needed to elaborate more on the video. And let's move that.
Yeah, so I can talk through this video real quick. So what you'll see is they start by removing the turf grass, first with the edges of this central part of the rain garden. And what I think is really the most important part to take note of is just how much soil they're removing. So with a rain garden, you're only going 6 inches deep, but that is still literal tons of soil that they're removing from the landscape. And this is really what allows the rain garden to capture so much of that stormwater runoff. So after they remove the soil, they make sure everything is level, and then they eventually mulch the area. And here's something that I often forget to do, is rather than just putting the plants in the ground, it's really important to lay them out first, make sure that you'll have plants throughout the entirety of the rain garden. I know sometimes when I've tried to just put them in the ground, I end up with some plants that are super densely planted close together, and then there's not too much for the end of my planting. So now they're just spreading that mulch, putting the plants in, and clearing out the storm drain. You'll notice that they're putting some rocks by the entry to the rain garden. What that does is it slows the velocity at which water enters the planting. Right after you get that rain garden installed, it's really important to make sure that the area gets lots of water. It'll need a really big drink right when it gets established. That'll help the roots really get nestled into the ground. And there you go, it's as simple as that. I bet all of you can also install your rain gardens in, what was that, like 90 seconds. So yeah. A fun little weekend project for you.
I will say the two most common questions I get from people about rain gardens is, you know, how hard is it to do and how much will it cost? You can make a rain garden as small or as big as you want it to be, and it can be relatively inexpensive or quite expensive depending on especially the hardscaping materials that you use. But for perspective, when we first moved into my house, I built a rain garden in our backyard pretty much entirely by myself, and I was 5 months pregnant, and I did almost all the work by hand and, you know, enlisted my husband's help a little bit for moving a couple of big rocks, but it cost about $300 total for the plants, the mulch, some compost, and a little bit of, you know, just plastic hardware to be able to extend our drain downspout coming off of the house to go into the rain garden. And a typical watershed district cost share grant, it's pretty easy to get a grant for, you know, something like $250 to $500. So that would cover a very simple rain garden. Sometimes people like to get really elaborate, you know, they have very fancy yards and they want everything to match, and they want to have nice big boulders that are the same color of boulder as the other boulders in your yard. Well, obviously that's going to be a lot more expensive. The watershed district isn't going to be able to provide funds for those kind of fancy aesthetic only features, but they will be able to help pay for the actual, you know, the actual plants and, you know, what's actually needed to make the garden be a functional garden.
So Angie,
Oh,
real quick, you said
yeah.
that you also get lots of questions about how long does it take. So
Oh,
how long, yeah, how long would you
yeah,
estimate?
yeah. So how long does it take? I mean, when I did mine, it took about a weekend. I picked a long weekend. I did it on the 4th of July weekend so that I had, a full 3 days to work on it. But that seems to be most people, they end up spending about a week from beginning to end. Some people will stretch it out, you maybe get it mostly done and then you don't have quite the right plants. And so it sits there for a couple weeks until you're able to go and buy the plants. But in general, it seems like once people finally make that leap to get started, it's something that you can hammer out in a weekend or hammer out in a long weekend. Another kind of variation that we do a lot of in our area, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 lakes in Washington County. So there is a lot of shoreline, and native plants are really important along the shoreline for habitat, not just for pollinators, but for the turtles, the frogs, the birds, the fish. And they are also vital to be able to stabilize the shore against wave erosion and against runoff that might be coming down. So we work with people if they have an existing shoreline that maybe in the past they had cut down the buffer and it's nothing but turf, or it's just kind of scrabbly rock, and be able to restore it back to having native plants. And this image here is from one that's in the Rice Creek Watershed District. It's at Lake Josephine. So it's a really, really beautiful example. And as you can tell, the people are still able to access having a dock. They're still able to sometimes have a small beach area, but just looking at enhancing and stabilizing the shoreline by using the native plants. Pollinator beneficial trees and shrubs. This is so important as well, because I think most people's minds, when you're thinking about bees and butterflies, we immediately think of flowers. And yes, the flowers have great nectar source, but the trees and the shrubs are really important as well. And the trees and shrubs are actually some of the earliest bloomers in the spring. Think of the apple blossoms, the cherry blossoms. Those are some of the first flowers that you see in the spring. And so that's really, really important for the pollinators. And there's a lot of the pollinators, like monarchs as well, that they will be happiest when they're in an area. Maybe they can go to the liatris that's blooming, but then they'll fly up into the oak trees that are nearby, and that's where they'll kind of nest and rest. So they really need to have a complete habitat that has both stuff high up and stuff that's down low. So there's examples listed here of many different kinds of trees and shrubs that are good, have early blooming flowers, and are really good habitat. These are all ones that are good for birds as well. Trees like the oak and the maple are also really important if you're looking at birds, because they attract a lot of larval insects that the birds eat during the summertime. And so that's a vital source of protein for the birds. Okay. James, am I turning things over here to you, or is this still in my section?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about the bee life cycle. So, so most bees are alive for just one season at a time. And there's really not too much insight about the bee life cycle. So do note that honeybees are kind of their own separate deal, but I'll talk a little bit about the bumblebee life cycle. So the bees that emerge in the early spring are actually the new queens that were laid and grew to maturity the previous summer. So right now, we're just first now starting to see the new queens, and it is only those new queen bumblebees that are going to overwinter and eventually come out in spring of 2021. So when those bees emerge, they are actually already, so they were impregnated the previous spring/summer, and the first thing they'll do is lay new eggs and start going out, gathering pollen, gathering nectar to provide provisions for their hive. Once those eggs that they've laid start to hatch and mature, then the queen will start focusing more on egg laying, and it'll be those new bees that have emerged that'll go out and do the foraging. And that'll be the case from the early summer through probably the late summer. From then, the colony will kind of switch its priorities again. and it'll move towards laying those new queens. So the cycle continues. So the new queens will get ready to overwinter. The colony will gather food for those new queens so it can survive through the winter, so it can hibernate, emerge, and have some food when it comes out. And the cycle continues where, following spring, the new queens emerge, they gather pollen, they lay their eggs, etc. So just a little bit of insight into the life cycle of a bumblebee.
Okay, let's see where we are at. I was talking about the trees and the shrubs earlier, and the Washington Conservation District does a low-cost tree sale every year. And during the sale, we sell bundles of bare root saplings or seedlings that are a year old, 25 trees for $35. So it's a really affordable way to be able to plant a lot of trees, especially if you have a large property. And generally that tree sale, we'll start taking orders around the end of November, and people order throughout the winter and then pick up trees at the end of April out at the county fairgrounds. So if you are interested in planting trees, wanting to get a large amount for a large property, definitely get in and start ordering early, because some of the species will be sold out, before Christmas comes even. Okay, so this part, though, I know for sure that I'm turning over to James to talk a little bit about pollinator lawns, which is a new trend that we're seeing a lot of people interested in doing, a way to enhance your lawns to provide some nectar habitat for the pollinators as well.
Yeah. So I love plantings of all shapes and sizes. Just like Angie said, I believe that there's room in every yard for at least a small garden. What we do have a lot of there's a whole lot of turf grass. And we like to be, cognizant. We like to recognize that many individuals like the recreation and the aesthetic associated with turf grass. So our goal is to kind of create a planting option that works with the turf grass rather than flat out requiring you to remove it. So how these pollinator lawns function is it's ideally fine fescue grass, which is that really thin species of turf grass, or Kentucky bluegrass, grown alongside some low-growing flowers that you probably recognize a few of them. And the ultimate goal is to create kind of a matrix of turf and flowers in your lawn, such that it still maintains that common aesthetic. You can still have recreation on the surface, but there's also some forage there for pollinators to feed on. So here I'm going to run you the basics of how to establish one of those pollinator lawns. Do note that this example for overseeding or seeding into a pre-existing lawn, it's only going to work if you have a healthy lawn and a lawn that has either fine fescue or Kentucky bluegrass growing. So step one is to mow your lawn as short as possible. And directly after you do that mow, you actually want to rake away the clippings. So I know normally we tell you to keep the clippings, but in this example, because we want to make sure that the seeds have perfect contact with the soil, or as close to perfect contact with the soil as possible, raking away those clippings is actually going to expose the soil so the seeds can hit the ground. After that, after you've mowed the area and you've taken away those clippings, now you're ready to spread the seed. And the goal is to have all of those seeds reaching the ground. So lowering the height of the turf grass and taking away those clippings helps to ensure that. And once you've done that, the key is keeping the area moist. The number one reason that I see bee lawns fail is because people spread those seeds and they think that the job is done. You have to make sure that that area stays moist until sprouting. I would recommend watering every other day for the first 30 days to make sure that those plants can get established nicely. As for maintenance, you can mostly keep your lawn the same. There's a couple little things that I want you to remember. So most of these plants start to bloom when they reach 2 to 2.5 inches in height. So we would like you to keep your mowing to a minimum height of 3 inches. I encourage everyone to follow the mowing rule of 1/3. If you're not a turf grass science nerd like I am, what that means is you never want to mow more than 1/3 of the total plant height. So if you like a lawn kept at 3 inches, you think that's a nice, neat look, a nice aesthetic, I would say to let your grass grow out to 4.5 inches, cut back to 3. So you're moving 1.5 inches of turf, you're moving 1/3 of the plant. If you want to let your grass grow a little bit longer, which means you can mow less frequently, which means there will be more blooms in your lawn for the bees, then what I would recommend doing is letting your lawn grow out to 6 inches in height and cutting back to 4 inches. Another thing that's very important is you will not be able to apply herbicides. Herbicides will kill your flowers. So the flower species that I'll talk about in just a few moments, We do not want to apply herbicides as those flowers will be killed, so hand weed as you see fit. Something that's really timely is we're actually just about to hit a really good window of time to start planting these bee lawns. There's 3 windows of time that I really like to utilize, and one of them is that kind of summer to fall transition. Once we're out of the dead heat of summer, the hottest parts of the summer, that's actually a really nice time to establish a bee lawn. So turfgrass and many flowers grow best here in northern climates between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So whenever we start to hit that temperature range, being kind of the what we see mostly from day to day, that's a really good job to establish a bee lawn. The other 2 windows of time I would recommend is in the spring, right after snow melt, and also in the fall is what's called a dormant seeding. A dormant seeding, you want to aim for soil temperatures between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So now we'll talk a little bit about the preferred floral species for these plantings. So bee lawn flowers meet the following conditions. 1, they must establish in Minnesota soils. 2, they have to serve as high quality forage for wild bees. And 3, they have to be able to survive alongside establish alongside grasses and tolerate mowing. So tolerate mowing, when you think about what mowing actually does to a flower, you are taking off the majority of the plant. The flower head, a lot of the stem, a lot of the vegetation, and that will actually kill most flowers. So the hardest part of figuring out what flowers would work in a bee lawn was figuring out what plant species can actually tolerate a mowing. So here's 2 examples of those flowers, and I'll talk about them very in depth, being self-heal and creeping thyme. So self-heal is actually one of my favorite flowers in the bee lawn mix. If I'm being honest, they're kind of all of my I love them all for different reasons. But what's really great about self-heal is that it's a native flower. It was really difficult for us to find native species to use in these lawns. Most of the species that bloom at such low heights are non-native, but self-heal is a native flower that works really nicely in a bee lawn. It has these medium to large whorled blooms, and when we were kind of thinking about what bees we would expect to find on this flower, we thought that whorled bloom, that long flower neck, would mean that really mostly medium to large sized bees would be able to get in there and access the nectar and nectar and pollen. This flower species was thought to be mostly a nectar source, with pollen being sparsely used or really not available at all. And where this flower establishes is mostly full to part sun sites, and some soil moisture is good. So you definitely want to make sure that you're watering your bee lawns at least once a week if you want self-heal to survive. And that is, for the most part, the visitors we saw, those larger bees. So our hypothesis was correct in that the self-heal does support larger bees, but it wasn't larger bees alone that we saw. We also saw smaller bees as well. So here's an example of an osmia bee, one of those early season bees that, that has this kind of blue-green coloration to it. Something else that we thought was that self-heal was only a nectar source. But we did find that there is some pollen use too, and I want to share this video with you guys real quick to show a bumblebee gathering pollen from self-heal. So what you'll see is its arms kind of combing through the hairs as it's foraging. And what that shows is it's collecting pollen and pushing it downwards towards its pollen sacs. So you'll see those front legs going, followed by the back legs directly after. So it's pushing the pollen down from the thorax, down through the abdomen into those pollen sacs. So just a really neat example of a bumblebee that was Bombus bimaculatus, I believe. I would have to take another closer look at it, using self-heal not only for nectar, but also collecting pollen from it as well. Another flower that I want to talk about is creeping thyme. So now this flower is extremely different from self-heal, especially from a pollinator's point of view. So rather than having somewhat larger, kind of more closed off blooms with that long floral neck, now we're seeing really small, wide open blooms, which lends itself really nicely to smaller pollinators. Creeping thyme has fantastic drought tolerance and winter hardiness as well. I'm sure I don't have to tell a room full of Minnesotans and one individual from Oregon just how important it is to have winter hardiness in a flower here in Minnesota. Something else that I've heard about creeping thyme, and do note that this is mostly anecdotal evidence, is that it works as a pretty good deer deterrent. So deers apparently don't like the taste and smell associated with the vegetation of creeping thyme. So if you do sometimes on occasion have difficulties keeping deers away from your plantings, you might want to try considering using creeping thyme as a border plant. Might help you deter those deers a little bit. So I mentioned smaller bees. Here is a picture of an Ogochlorella bee, a small iridescent green sweat bee, foraging on creeping thyme. This picture was taken at Willard Park in North Minneapolis, and I've seen tons of these Ogochlorella bees on this flower. It's a bee species that's active late in the season, and creeping thyme for the most part blooms right about now, actually, kind of middle or late August through the first 2 to 3 weeks of September. So a really great late season forage source for your bees. Dutch white clover is kind of what I would consider to be the gold medal species for a bee lawn. And the reason for that is what I discussed earlier, just the sheer diversity of bee species that use this flower. Dutch white clover blooms from like the middle of May all the way through the middle of September. So it has an extremely long bloom window, and it's a great source of both nectar and pollen. Another added benefit of this flower species is it's a nitrogen fixer. And nitrogen is an extremely important nutrient for any plant that you're looking to get established. So if you often apply fertilizers to the ground, if you have Dutch white clover in the landscape, it'll actually increase the amount of nitrogen that's available to those plants, reducing the amount of nitrogen that you'll have to apply yourself through fertilizer. And just a quick example of the sheer diversity of bees that you see on Dutch white clover. So this is a bee species that's very closely related to that Ogochlorella bee. This is an agaposmin on Dutch white clover. Here is one of those ground nesting bees. I believe it's an andrenid bee, but I would need a better look at the wings to tell you for sure. A bumblebee, this is Bombus rufosinctus on Dutch white clover. And it is believed that the rusty patch bumblebee would use Dutch white clover. There are sightings from Ontario, Canada of the rusty patch bumblebee using Dutch white clover. So you could keep that in the back of your head as well. And also, of course, the honeybee uses Dutch white clover all the time. So if there's any beekeepers near you and you want to help support their hives, putting some Dutch white clover in the ground will greatly help those colonies. So now, Angie, back to you to talk a little bit about pollinator meadows.
So the final type of project that we wanted to talk about are pollinator meadows. And you might also think about this as something that's a much larger project, more like a prairie restoration. And a lot of people who live in Washington County do have fairly large properties, 3, 5, even 10 acres in size. One of the ones that I'm going to show you today, this is in Stillwater Grant area out in the country, and the property owner, as you can see, has a small pond that used to just have turf mowed all the way down to the pond. And so they wanted to reduce their time spent mowing. There's a pretty steep slope going down to the water. It is wet in the ground when you're closer to the water and drier when you get up high. And of course, they wanted to have something that looked really pretty. So wait for it. This is what it looks like today. It's absolutely gorgeous. It is a, complete habitat now that there is a connection from those trees at the water's edge all the way up to these flowers that are here in the foreground. And it was about 1 acre in size that was converted from turf to the native plantings. You can see quite a few different native plants that are in here that are providing really great habitat and transitions, like I said, from the dry to the wet. So we do have at times grant funds available for these larger projects, and particularly if it's going to be converting turf to prairie or active crop fields to prairie, that's when the grant funds are most likely to be available. To create a pollinator meadow, the installation can be quite difficult to do without using chemicals, but it is possible to do it either by kind of taking off small bites, doing multiple pocket plantings that you pick off throughout the year or over a course of a couple of years, or spending a long time to do sheet mulch or solarization to be able to prep the land ahead of time. With the larger properties, we always tell people that the first 2 to 3 years are going to be the hardest. So people invest a lot of energy to putting in these restored prairies, these meadows, and the first year, it pretty honestly is not going to look very impressive. And you just need to know that going in, that you're going to put in a lot of work and it's going to be worth it. In the end, it's going to look like that pretty picture. But during those first years, that's when you're really working on hitting back any of the invasive species and the weeds that keep coming up. You know, keeping the new native plants watered so that they can get established and get their roots down there. And generally, we're going to be recommending even that you're going through and mowing, which is kind of heartbreaking. You know, you finally have some of those plants come up and they get the little flowers, and we're saying, no, you need to mow it down to help kill off the weeds and let the plants put their energy into putting down their roots instead of into the flowers. So with native plants in general, though, there are a couple of key times to do maintenance, and I'm talking now more back to like the smaller scale. If you have a native garden, you're really going to want to hit the weeds during Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day. This is going to be a time when different problematic weeds are most prevalent. And if you think of just having these 3 key times, then during the rest of the summer, you can take it easy a little bit. Main things are going to be to pull back any weeds that are coming in, divide, transplant, or add new plants if needed, mulch if needed, and look around and see if there's any erosion or trouble spots. In the background behind me, you might even be able to tell I've got this flower vase full of flowers. And this is one of my tricks when I'm going out there and I'm having to cut back plants, because, you know, psychologically, sometimes this is hard. You go out there and it's something you intentionally planted and it's doing well, but maybe it's just a little too bodacious and out of control. So it helps if you go out there with a vase and you're like, no, I'm creating like a beautiful vase to put inside my home. And then you don't feel so bad about the fact that, you know, you're pulling out some things and making room so that the garden is just a little bit more balanced, or so that you don't have flowers flopping all over the sidewalk or the driveway. During the spring, it's really important to wait until the average temperature is over 50 before you are cutting back plants, because like James was talking about earlier, there's so many of the bees that are nesting in the stems of the plants, and we want to give them a chance to emerge in the spring before you go down and, you know, cut them all down and throw them away. If you go to the Conservation District's website, and I think I'll have a link to that in a little bit, we do have some nice maintenance guides there at our Adopt a Rain Garden page. And you can even download a calendar that you could save to your Outlook or Google Calendar that will give you reminders when there's things that need to be done. We are coming up on the fall. Amazingly enough, school's going to be starting soon. So some of the things to be doing in the fall. One of the things you don't want to do, I guess I should start with what you don't want to do. People often think fall is when you need to cut down all that dry stuff before the winter comes. And like I just said, we want people to get in the habit of leaving that up during the winter and cutting it down in the late spring. An added benefit is that there's usually seed heads that the birds will continue to eat during the course of the winter. So you'll see a lot of birds that are perching on your gardens, on especially the tall stuff that sticks up out of the snow. If you have plants that maybe you don't want to be, you know, they're ones that have prolific seeds and you don't want them to be spreading, there's something called deadheading that you can go around and cut those off and collect them. Or vice versa, you can collect those if you want to be able to plant them in a different garden. It's a good time to trim shrubs. One of the weeds to watch for is the ragweed that blooms in the summertime. So that's, you know, that's blooming right now, and this would be a good time to get rid of that. Okay, so what now? So we've come to the end of giving you all of these resources, and what can you do now? If you are a resident of Washington County, on our website, you can sign up for a free site visit, and that could be a good first step. I will tell you that we have a couple of staff out of the office right now, one who's on vacation and one who's sick. So we're going to be a little slower than normal in being able to come out and meet with you on your property. But that's a good first place to get started. Going to the bluethumb.org website and looking into the Lawns to Legumes program. and start talking to your neighbors about if you can do something that's maybe bigger than just something on your own property. Clicking through here. So like I said, you can sign up for a free site visit. Cost share opportunities. There are cost share grants throughout Washington County, and there are grants very often in Ramsey, Dakota, Anoka, Chisago County as well. In Washington County, we do have 8 different watershed management areas, and typically the grants are going to be coming through one of these watershed districts, not through our office. So our staff will be the one that meets with you, and then they'll help you to fill out, for example, a cost share grant application for the Valley Branch Watershed District. And if you were to get a $500 plant grant, that's who would be giving you the money. So we work hand in hand with them. When you sign up for a site visit, this map is there also, so you'll be able to figure out which watershed you live in. And clicky, clicky, clicky. The next question that people most often ask is, where can I go to find plants? If you go to the bluethumb.org website, there is a map function where you can find local partners. This resource put together by Wild Ones of Minnesota is also really good. It shows where all the native plant retailers are that are in Minnesota and Western Wisconsin. And we're really lucky because we have many that are in our area that are not too far of a drive away that you can choose from. There is a Pollinator Summit coming up on Monday, September 14th through Friday, September 18th. James, do you want to say anything about this? Have you been helping to plan this event?
Yeah. So I'll actually be one of the hosts here. And this year's Pollinator Summit, it's going to be largely themed around the Lawns Legumes program, but even more so on the actions that different residents can take to support pollinators on through residential plantings. There's going to be great there's going to be great presenters from not even all over Minnesota, but all over the country, and even some out-of-country speakers. So some really great sessions to think about, everything from how to install a landscape, what you can do to specifically support the rusty patch bumblebee, ways that vacant lots are being transformed in Cleveland, Ohio, to conserve all different bee species. And Catherine Baldock from the UK, she is probably the world's leading researcher on urban landscape management for pollinators. She'll be giving a 1-hour talk all about her research and steps that residents can take to support pollinators in urban landscapes. So it's going to be $8 per session, or you can buy it all for $60 and save $20. It's going to be presented by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in collaboration with Bowser, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and Metro Blooms, the organization I work for, is going to be helping out a little bit too. One note that I actually want to add about this sheet that you were talking about from Wild Ones is, if you're worried about sourcing your plants and how to know if it's going to be chemical free or not, Wild Ones actually goes out of their way to make sure that everyone included on their list does not apply chemicals to their plants. So if you're looking for a safe place to purchase plants, everything on this slide that Angie prepared for us is good to go for sure.
Yeah, excellent. So, have hope. I know that this has been an extremely stressful year for almost everybody. It's easy to be overwhelmed, but there really are simple, fun things that you can do. And in partnership, if we all do these little things, it really does add up and make a big difference. I really loved that graphic that James showed earlier, how all of those gardens connected in Minneapolis. You know, we're all a little piece of that puzzle, that working together, we can create something really amazing. We can really transform our landscape and have a beautiful place that we can live, and that we can live in harmony with nature. So thank you so much for taking the first step and learning about pollinators